Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our second panel assessing U.S.-Soviet relations in the 1960s and 70s. I'm not going to chair the panel, but I will turn the duties over to my colleague here at the Miller Center, Professor Barbara Perry, who's going to anchor the panel. Barbara is herself a noted scholar of the 60s and of the Kennedy era and of the Kennedy clan. She's also the director of presidential studies here at the Miller Center. She is a very seasoned, expert oral historian as well as a written historian. And for many years she helped lead the oral history program here at the Miller Center, which was one of the signature undertakings that we do in interviewing the leading members of presidential administrations from the Ford years on up until the present, or at least I should say the recent past. We have completed oral histories under her leadership and Russell Riley's leadership of every administration through the George W. Bush administration, and we're planning to lay siege to the Obama administration, and we'll find out what the Trump administration, what their attitude is towards being interviewed for oral history when we get to that place. But in any case, Barbara's going to take us forward in this panel, and I'll turn things over to her. Barbara.
Thanks so much, Will, and of course to Mel and to Stephanie for conceptualizing and organizing and executing such a timely yet history-based battle conference this year. And of course, this is the very essence of Miller Center scholarship and programming. I am delighted to moderate this 11 o'clock panel. We'll go to about 1 o'clock. And we'll do this in two halves. So the first half of our discussion will feature my Miller Center colleague immediately to my left, Mark Silverstone. Mark is an associate professor of presidential studies here at the Miller Center, and he chairs the center's presidential recordings program, which analyzes, transcribes, edits, and annotates the secret White House tapes, particularly from the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations. And if you watch the Ken Burns Vietnam series, you will have seen Mark's name and our colleague Ken Hughes' name prominently displayed in the credits of each episode because they were crucial to providing the clips from particularly the Nixon and the Johnson years, but some of the Kennedy tapes as well. Mark is a foreign policy historian of the first order, focusing on the Cold War and especially one element of the hot war, Vietnam, in that era. And particularly the Kennedy and Johnson policies towards it. My favorite of his many publications is his book, A Companion to John F. Kennedy, which sounds like it might be about some of the girlfriends of the president, but it is meant itself to be a companion, and some of that story is covered in that volume. But it very seriously, this is a major work that Mark edited. It has seminal historiographic essays on virtually every topic related to JFK's life and his career, and particularly his presidency, and I rely on it almost exclusively as I'm preparing to speak about President Kennedy. And I think of Tim Naftali as my colleague, even though he preceded me at the Miller Center by several years, where he served here as the director of the Miller Center's Kremlin Decision-Making Project. And then Tim, after serving as director of the Nixon Library, has become a clinical associate professor of history and also of public service at NYU. He's the co-author among many books, but one particularly pertinent for today's topic called Khrushchev's Cold War with Alexander Fersenko. And if, like me, you are a fan of CNN documentaries, you will readily recognize him as the star of many of them. I highly recommend to all of you here today, if you haven't read them already, the 4 essays for this panel. They are all informative, they are very accessible and compelling. And I want to begin with Mark, and actually begin with the end of his essay, which is a set of conclusions that he draws on JFK's role and behavior in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and most importantly for our conference here over these several days, to draw out the lessons of JFK's role and behavior in the Cuban Missile Crisis for current issues. And then after Mark does that, then we'll turn to Tim, and he'll offer some lessons as well from the Khrushchev side, from the Russian side. So with that, let me turn to Mark.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Good morning, good late morning to everybody, and thanks again to Mel and to Will for the opportunity to participate in this. Looking out at the audience, there are any number of people who have written copious amounts on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I have not, so I have learned from all of you, but I appreciate the opportunity to try to distill a little bit of what I have learned and to offer, again, some lessons on how that may bear on contemporary matters. John F. Kennedy had already learned some important lessons by the time he had to confront Moscow's deployment of nuclear missiles to Cuba. Several of these lessons involved matters related to personnel and process, and they would be immensely useful during the missile crisis in October 1962. Many of them grew out of Kennedy's earlier crisis over Cuba, the failed operation at the Bay of Pigs, which meant that these lessons were especially hard-earned. They were not without qualification, but by and large, they ended up serving him, the country, and the world pretty well. But before highlighting these lessons, which may or may not be applicable to contemporary U.S.-Russian relations, I wanted to touch on some of that earlier history of the Kennedy presidency, which the president did not translate into useful insight, and which contributed to the onset of the missile crisis itself. The first of these lessons involved not the more constructive ones related to personnel and process, but to the negative ones related to policy and actually policy pronouncement, to be excessively alliterative, I suppose. While planning for the overthrow of Fidel Castro had gathered a pretty full head of steam during the last year of the Eisenhower administration, Kennedy's rhetoric at the tail end of the 1960 election campaign came pretty close to operationalizing it. His provocative language in October of 1960, which called for more aggressive action to undermine the Cuban regime, might have helped him win votes less than 3 weeks later. He certainly needed it. But it raised the political cost of canceling what would become the Bay of Pigs operation, were he had to have done so when he became president. So here's the first case in the trajectory toward October of 1962 where I think words really mattered. While this public pronouncement narrowed Kennedy's room for maneuver on Cuba once he became president, the failure of his administration to consider more creative policy measures stemmed from the absence of a searching conversation about the relative dangers that Cuba posed. Was Castro really a dagger to the heart, or was he more a thorn in the flesh, as Senate Foreign Relations Chair Bill Fulbright had suggested? That conversation really never took place. While Kennedy did hold a series of meetings, large and small, with those planning the Bay of Pigs operation and with senior civilian and military officials, they revolved largely around matters of tactics and operational details, as opposed to the broader strategic implications of the operation, or even the underlying assumptions that Fulbright had alluded to. So both pronouncement and policy, statements about the necessity of moving against Castro, as well as the policy that was in train to effect it, made it more likely that Kennedy would mount some aggressive operation to undermine the Castro regime once he became president. The persistence of that policy, and even the intensification of it after the Bay of Pigs, would later contribute to the onset of the missile crisis itself. As I mentioned in the paper, and as Tim and others here at the conference have documented so well, it was hardly the only reason for the missile deployment and the crisis that it sparked. But by the fall of 1961, Fidel Castro was commanding more and more attention from the Kennedy administration, which was devoting increasingly greater resources to undermining the Cuban regime. And as those efforts at subversion and sabotage came to look more menacing to both Havana and to Moscow, they helped push Khrushchev toward action that might protect the Cuban Revolution, with one of those actions being the deployment of nuclear missiles to the island. In the course of that deployment, Kennedy's overt rhetoric, as well as the continuation of covert action, would again complicate his presidency and again raised the stakes of not following through on his stated intentions. In an effort to once more derive political benefit from a policy statement on Cuba, Kennedy declared in September 1962, 2 months before the midterm elections, that the introduction of offensive weapon systems to the island would result in the gravest of circumstances, effectively establishing a public red line for all to see. So both administration policy and pronouncements about it continue to heighten the drama surrounding Cuba, which helped to shape Khrushchev's and then Kennedy's responses to developments on the island. But if Kennedy failed to recognize or to consider how these statements and activities might box himself into situations that created real risks for his presidency, as well as for the nation and the world, he nonetheless took positive steps to ensure that the way he managed national security policy gave him at least a better shot at getting good advice and making wiser judgments. Those more salutary measures involved changes in personnel and process, and both proved helpful in resolving the October missile crisis. For one, the aides he trusted most, particularly his brother Robert, the Attorney General, would come to play larger roles in national security policymaking, and Bobby would serve as chief conduit for the president's private conversations with Moscow. As Tim has highlighted, those back-channel conversations were not all to the good, but they certainly helped to convey key bits of information at key moments of the crisis. Kennedy would also routinize and systematize national security policymaking more effectively, helping to improve the flow of information into the White House. And in an effort to really scrub the options for addressing the Soviet missile deployment, Kennedy encouraged extended conversations among his senior civilian and military aides, shielded from public view, before settling on an approach that gave himself and his adversary time to reflect on the magnitude of what lay before them and to figure out how they might untie the knot of war. But perhaps of paramount importance was the sheer judgment of the president himself, who, after initially lurching toward a military response, considered its less than ideal chances for success, its potential impact on allies and adversaries, and the zealotry of those around him, particularly in the military, who supported it as virtually the only acceptable option. So if there's to be a heroic narrative, to harken back to yesterday, within the Cold War about leaders who took chances, who faced down the hawks calling for war, and who ultimately preferred that his kids be red rather than dead, Kennedy should take at least one turn in that starring role, which I'd say he continued to earn through his subsequent efforts at arms control and through his attempts to modulate the Cold War, at least rhetorically, through his American University address. So can elements of this heroic narrative spawn another one? How can this history provide useful lessons for contemporary U.S.-Russian relations? Here are a few thoughts. On the matter of rhetoric, as I mentioned in my written piece and briefly this morning, red lines can be trouble. They were for Kennedy, who felt constrained by the politics associated with them. Perhaps President Trump's wholly different posture toward Russia means he's less likely to make them with regard to developments in Ukraine or in the Baltics. He certainly hasn't thrown down any such marker with regard to interference in U.S. domestic politics. It's easier to see him doing so with regard to North Korea or Iran. And with Syria, he essentially acknowledged Obama's red line and acted upon it. But given his lack of rhetorical discipline, his disdain for convention, and his freewheeling use of new media, it's probably more likely than not that he'll deliver this kind of an ultimatum before long, though arguably he may calculate the political costs of doing so very differently than Kennedy did. On playing for time and keeping the conversation going, these lessons from the missile crisis are particularly relevant for crisis situations, though they're suggestive of the value of maintaining contact and of cultivating relationships more broadly. Jaw is better than wah, as Churchill is alleged to have said. And while U.S.-Russian relations have now reverted, as we heard yesterday and a little bit this morning, to that more historically natural condition of conflict, which pre- and postdates the Cold War, I would hope that the virtues of diplomacy, of enhancing one's capacity for empathy, another quality that we associate with Kennedy and the missile crisis, would commend themselves to leaders on both sides. Finally, on the matter of combining that diplomacy with force, it certainly complicates the narrative. the heroic narrative, if you will, that we've heard for a while. To acknowledge that Khrushchev had agreed to pack up the missiles and ship them home before hearing that JFK was willing to make the missile trade that Khrushchev called for on the 12th day of the missile crisis. That shouldn't negate the value of the Cuba for Turkey missile swap for Khrushchev's own purposes, for allowing him to paper over his having to reverse course on his exceedingly risky maneuver. But it does suggest that the prospect of a military engagement both prompted Khrushchev's initial offer to remove the missiles in return for a non-invasion pledge, and then to forego his public call for a missile swap when it seemed that war really was imminent. That said, this kind of brinksmanship could easily have resulted in armed conflict, and potentially nuclear armed conflict, as many here, as well as Mike Dobbs have written. So while Kennedy's mobilization of force really does seem to have made his diplomacy more effective, we'll need to be much more granular in outlining in what form, in what strategic context, and with what implications it should be similarly mobilized if it's to play a role in a more contemporary scenario in which Americans and Russians find themselves eyeball to eyeball. Thanks.
Well, Tim's essay has an especially evocative title. It is called Grab God by the Beard, Khrushchev and the Kennedys.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks, Mel, for inviting me back. It's nice to be home. We've heard a lot about the longue durée. I'm a short durée historian, in part because I drink a lot of espresso, but in part because I'm going to play on a word that my former colleague and friend, present friend, former colleague, Mark mentioned, which is granular. What we have for the 60s is a granular understanding of this period, both because of the American side, the tapes, which I spent some time with here, and on the Soviet side. And so we have the capacity of understanding the international politics and domestic politics of that period in a way that is not true of every period in international politics. And so we're going to, as you've just benefited from that and listening to Mark, I'm going to try to do the same on the Soviet side. Now, to lay the basis for this period, I want to mention or remind you of a few things. Because of the structure of this conference, we sort of jumped over Korea. I believe that the Korean War is fundamental to understanding the militarization of the Cold War, and that absent Korea, you want to talk, as Jeremy mentioned, you want to talk about possibilities. You don't have the Korean War, and I think there's a change in the nature of the competition between the Soviets and the United States. So we perhaps in the Q&A we can talk about Korea. Korea is extremely important. But there are two other things that are extraordinarily important that are happening in the world that are going to shape the environment that Kennedy and Khrushchev are seeking to manage. One is the decolonization of what I guess Mao first called Third World and the developing world. That's a very important event, and that is an independent variable from the U.S.-Soviet relationship. But it opens up the possibility for the Soviets and Khrushchev to, Khrushchev sees it as a source of opportunity. The other is a Soviet achievement, and that's Sputnik. And that changes the nature of the strategic relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. As Frank mentioned, once the American homeland gets threatened, that raises questions about the extent to which extended deterrence is real. Will Americans, as Frank said, will Americans actually put New York at risk for the sake of Paris? And that happens because of Sputnik. So you have these two destabilizing events that are happening in the 50s, and it's that world that Khrushchev and Kennedy are seeking to manage. Now, Khrushchev's approach to that world is not what Americans anticipated. The sense that Kennedy has coming into office is that there is so much nuclear danger about that wise statesmanship involves reducing the threat of nuclear war. But as we see with Khrushchev, Khrushchev is all about disruption. He's a disruptor. He is interested in crisis. And it's why he's interested in crisis that I think is the essence of understanding his behavior, not simply in 1961, but in 1962. So let me talk to you about a summit conference in 1961 that people don't talk about. The one that everybody talks about is Vienna. I'm working on a book about Kennedy. I want to add the 5,300th book on Kennedy. Why not? And for me, the more interesting summit conference is the de Gaulle-Kennedy conference. Because de Gaulle and Kennedy are very explicit about their understanding of the world. And they share a lot. And de Gaulle's argument is, and it's an argument that has a relevance today. His argument is when you deal with a disruptor, you should ignore them. He says, let Khrushchev hyperventilate about Berlin. He's going to do nothing. He doesn't have the power to do anything. And the only thing you can do is actually increase his desire to disrupt by engaging him. Engagement is a mistake with a disruptor. And Kennedy's argument is, well, I can't take that chance. He's already threatened us in '58, and if he does it again, it means he's seeking something, or it means that there is something internal in the Soviet system that is forcing him, or the Soviet Empire, that is forcing him to do that, and I have to take that seriously because he could risk nuclear war out of the urgency to change the status quo in Central Europe. And de Gaulle said, no, I disagree with you completely. He says, you know what? Let the Soviets sign a peace treaty with East Germany. It doesn't matter. It's just a piece of paper between two communists. And Kennedy says, I don't agree with that at all. Because that would shift a sense of opportunity, burden, and power to East Berlin, which might lead to even more risk-taking in Europe. It's that basic debate, which you'll see over and over again about different countries and different leaders. Do you leave them alone, or do you engage? And is the engagement, the decision to engage, somehow threatening to your own standing, whether at home or abroad? Now, it turns out that de Gaulle was wrong. And we really only knew how wrong de Gaulle was when we saw the Soviet materials about 15 years ago, when, oddly enough, a Putin government declassified the resolutions and transcripts of the Politburo Presidium meetings in the 1950s through 1964. It turns out that Khrushchev was committed to revising the Cold War, the World War II settlement in Europe. He was a revisionist. All right, he was not seeking more security through reducing nuclear danger. He was prepared to take advantage of the existence of nuclear danger to achieve a revision of the World War II settlement, particularly in Berlin. And as we learned from presidential records, Khrushchev told his colleagues that he was even willing to use force to achieve what was required in Berlin. Now, de Gaulle had not assumed that. De Gaulle was convinced that when push came to shove, Khrushchev would not use force. But Khrushchev, before Vienna, tells his colleagues, once we sign a peace treaty with East Germany, we're not going to make the mistake that Stalin made in 1948 and 49, We are not going to allow the West to use the air corridors to continue to supply West Berlin. We are going to shoot down a British or American plane to send a signal that the air corridors are closed. Now, de Gaulle did not predict that. Kennedy did. And Kennedy's thinking was, we must engage to give the Russians a sense that if they choose diplomacy over militarized conflict, that something good will come out of it. So in 1961, without having access to the internal discussions of the Politburo, because the CIA never penetrated the Presidium, Kennedy's deep sense of politicians led him to make a different call from de Gaulle. Now, I'm going to give you an aside on Kennedy, and then we'll move to Khrushchev. If you want to understand the way in which Kennedy thought about foreign leaders or domestic leaders, you should read Profiles in Courage. Even though Kennedy didn't write the final draft, I don't believe, it represents Kennedy-esque thinking about power. And Kennedy was all about understanding the interests and incentives that shaped politicians' decision-making. And what he did was he projected that on the Soviet leadership. And he projected it on France, and he projected it on every single leader he ever dealt with. He assumed they had interests, and if you could change the incentive structure, you might alter the way in which they acted on their interests. Now, when he tries this initially on Khrushchev in 1961, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because Khrushchev is not interested in engaging the United States. What he wants is the revised settlement in Berlin. And he is willing to take risks to achieve it. And he's willing to have a bad summit conference in Vienna. One of the old arguments about Vienna, the conference between Kennedy and Khrushchev in June of 1961, was that Kennedy screwed up. It was a mistake. Kennedy was immature, he was callow, he didn't understand what he was doing. Soviet records later rest that argument. Khrushchev went to Vienna spoiling for a fight. There was nothing John F. Kennedy could have done save concede a NATO presence in West Berlin. Save conceding that, there was nothing Kennedy could have done to have had a good conference at Vienna. Vienna was set up. It was an ambush. And Khrushchev set it up. Khrushchev wanted to put pressure on Kennedy in the hope that Kennedy would give him something that Eisenhower had not been willing to give him, which was the removal of the NATO presence in West Berlin. Kennedy stood up to him, didn't give in, went home, rattled some sabers, called up some reserves, and Khrushchev backs down. The essential thing to understand about Khrushchev, I believe, in foreign policy at the time, is that he believed that the Soviet Union was strategically inferior. American viewers, American observers, assumed that countries that believe themselves to be strategically inferior are not risk takers. It's a basic misunderstanding that you can see throughout the US foreign policy elite. Goes back to Japan before World War II. American observers of the international system, because they project the United States on the world, tend to think that foreign leaders who know that they are strategically inferior will not take risks. But in fact, many of America's adversaries do the opposite. They are strategically inferior, and that makes them decide to take a risk. That's why the Imperial Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And that's why the Soviets in 1961 and 62, Khrushchev, will undertake a series of crises that were not predictable if you knew that they knew they were behind. So why did Khrushchev do this? And the materials that we have, I think, argue or make a very strong argument for the way in which he thought about the world. I use the metaphor of a pufferfish. Khrushchev was a pufferfish. A pufferfish does not want to be eaten by bigger fish. So they puff themselves up. Khrushchev understood fundamentally that the Soviet Union was strategically inferior. He saw the United States as an existential threat to the world system that he hoped for. And as Vlad and Bill Taubman have so brilliantly argued, Khrushchev was a romantic. He believed, he was ideological. And he felt over time history would serve the Soviet experiment very well. But in the short term, the Soviets were vulnerable. And so you puff up the fish to avoid a war that you know you're going to lose. It's the puffing up of the fish which had an unintended consequence in the United States, because American public opinion doesn't handle puffer fishes very well. Americans get scared. And that's exactly what the Soviets hoped for, except that Americans then spend money on nuclear weapons when they get scared. And the Soviets couldn't compete. So in 1961, Khrushchev believes that because he's very well aware of the missile gap crisis, he believes that this will have a restraining effect on the use of American power, and perhaps will lead to an agreement in Central Europe. Kennedy, because he believes that he's always dealing with a rational actor, wants to change the incentive structure for Khrushchev. And what he does is he says, once the satellites provide the U.S. government with absolute certainty that the Soviets are way behind in the missile competition, he decides to share that with the Soviets, not directly by giving him a Corona document, but by having a public statement by Gilpatrick, the Undersecretary of Defense. The U.S. government does that thinking that if the Soviets know that they're behind, they will stop this risk-taking. They will just realize they shouldn't be doing this. It has the opposite effect, because this takes from Khrushchev his basic strategic approach to the international system. He can't be a pufferfish anymore. Everybody knows he's small. And that leads, I believe, to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The more research I do on the Cuban Missile Crisis, the less important I think Cuba is. That's just the way. And in 1962, Khrushchev attempts two different strategies for dealing with American power. The first is the meniscus strategy, where he decides to increase the amount of. He says the international system is a goblet. And what you do is you fill water right to the brim. And you bring it to the point where you have a meniscus, where the next drop of water will spill. The only way to restrain American power is to create crises along the periphery of the American empire. Now, no American advisor and no criminologist at the time would have ever assumed that was the Soviet approach. But Khrushchev made that the Soviet approach, and it lasted 4 months, until he saw the Americans were so powerful that they could deal with these crises along the border, crisis in Southeast Asia, crisis. And so Khrushchev needed another approach, and that's when he puts missiles in Cuba. He puts missiles in Cuba in order to scare the Americans so that he can contain American power. One of the lessons of studying Khrushchev that is relevant to today, and a couple of them, and I'll finish with that, is that Americans tend not to understand that their country is an existential threat to other people. Americans believe, what am I doing, generalizing? Let me put it this way. More often than not, American policymakers will believe that specific American actions will define how other countries view this country, when it's the very fact of American power, the hugeness of the economy, the size of the American military, which is a daily threat to many countries, which either will bandwagon with you or are going to try to oppose you. It's our very existence that poses a threat. Khrushchev never lost track of the fact that the United States was more powerful, was richer. He believed in the future, if the competition were kept to ideology and economic interaction, that the Soviets would ultimately bury us. That, by the way, he didn't mean because they killed us, but because we die and they continue to live. They'll be at our funeral. That's really what that means. If you understand, however, that we are an existential threat, that, first of all, makes you understand why people would act against you. The second is if you accept the proposition that strategically inferior countries will try to deter us by scaring us, then that will also, I think, allow you to understand certain foreign countries. I think this is much less useful in understanding Putin than it is in understanding North Korea. Or, if we could go back in time, understanding Saddam Hussein in 2001 and 2002. We have a hard time in this country understanding dictators because we assume that they play the game the way we do. And one of the, I think, outcomes of studying the Khrushchev-Kennedy relationship is that you see that Khrushchev was rational. It's just his inputs and incentives were different. The United States didn't understand them. But what Kennedy understood was that when push came to shove, Khrushchev was not suicidal. He was reckless, but he wasn't a madman. And it's that basic understanding that you have to constantly engage and be empathetic that laid the basis for, I think, Kennedy's masterful handling of the second week of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I would argue the first week of the Cuban Missile Crisis is much messier than people think. But it's this understanding of Khrushchev as basically being someone who was not a madman that made possible the peaceful resolution. So the lessons, I believe, to sum up, are that your adversary can be irrational in your eyes and actually be rational. And the irrationality that you have in this, your assessment of the rationality is part of your is a function of your assumptions. If you assume them to do one thing and they do something else, that makes them irrational to you. But in fact, their thinking is perfectly logical. The other thing to keep in mind is that other countries are afraid of us, and that fear can lead them to take risks, and that we should be more introspective about the nature of their fear. And this is not a judgment about moral, this is not moral equivalency. I'm just simply arguing that the very nature of the American success of the United States in developing its power also leads to challenges. And the early 60s, I think, is a time where the United States tried to engage the Soviets. And they were dealing with a leader who didn't want engagement, he wanted revision. And it's when he changes his mind that the system becomes much more stable. So this is an argument for the importance of individuals. There are some structural issues involved, but in the end, it's Khrushchev who decides in 1963, enough with this approach. I'm going to let Kennedy have his test ban. Thank you.
I'll just throw out one question that relates to both of your essays and comments, and then we'll open up the floor momentarily. And that is, could you delve a little bit more into the back channeling from, Mark, what you know from the Kennedy side, and particularly the Robert Kennedy back channeling, and Tim, from what you know, having delved into all of the archives on the other side of the ocean?
Well,
and lessons for today, particularly in light of issues related to back channeling with the Russians.
Right. Tim has particularly done great work on the back channel and its lack of use, in fact, at several key moments, and in fact its misuse, or at least the misinterpretation of its value, when Kennedy came to use it to try to figure out what was going on in the Caribbean in the summer of 1962, as it became clear that there were more and more Soviet shipments being sent to the island. It appeared as though there were weapon systems being delivered to the island. What's going on? It was used by Khrushchev essentially to provide disinformation. And so while it had been helpful in various places, particularly, let's say, with the the resolution of the October tank crisis in 1961, to have a chance to talk out of the public eye and such. I do think that at key points, it helped to keep the conversation going, and with regard to its use during the missile crisis, some of that conversation from Bobby Kennedy to with Anatoly Dobrynin, as Philip has actually indicated in another communication, was actually a front channel. I mean, that's a case where Kennedy was actually delivering a specific message to Bobby to speak to the person that you want to convey a message to, which is the ambassador to the Soviet Union. But I think it's a creative use. It's a recognition that the standard channels that you might use through the State Department are not always going to be effective. Kennedy wasn't particularly thrilled with the performance of his State Department, with Dean Rusk or with the hidebound nature of the system itself. So I think it provided him some other options to try to hear from people whose voices aren't heard as frequently. As we've heard in bits and pieces, it seems as though those channels are being used today with regard to North Korea, which sounds like it's an encouraging sign. But it's another way to keep the conversation going privately when publicly doing so would create some real political risks.
I think the Robert Kennedy Bolshevik back channel is more interesting as a reflection of John F. Kennedy's understanding of domestic politics than as a reflection on how the Soviets were thinking. Khrushchev was baffled by this back channel. If you look at the way in which they managed it, the Soviets really didn't want this back channel. They thought that the front door was good enough. Kennedy felt he had to use this back channel because he wanted to offer things to the Soviets that he couldn't talk about publicly. And he wanted it to be deniable. And he didn't trust the State Department. He thought there would be a leak. So he uses his brother. So I see the back channel as what John Kennedy actually thought about the Cold War. And so the American University speech of 1963 reflected ideas that Kennedy had in 61. There's a basic narrative for the Kennedy administration and Arthur Schlesinger was a great man and he wrote beautifully, but it's actually, I don't share it, which is that Kennedy is learning. Well, Kennedy thought the way about the Cold War in 61 that he said it publicly in 63, but he couldn't say it publicly. He didn't have the chops. It's the Cuban Missile Crisis that frees him to say these sorts of things. So he's actually sharing this with the Soviets in 61, and they're not listening. And they're not listening because Khrushchev wants to revise the World War II settlement in the heart of Europe. And he keeps saying Berlin, Berlin, Berlin. And when Kennedy is not saying Berlin via Bobby, he goes to Thompson and he talks to him directly at a skating rink and says, Berlin. He basically is getting all this back channel stuff. He doesn't want to hear about the test ban. He doesn't want to hear about a joint project to the moon. That's something that's often lost. John Kennedy proposed a joint project to the moon first. Before he told the world that we'll go to the moon before the end of the decade, he said to the Soviets, let's do this together. The Soviets weren't interested. Then he goes publicly and offers it, tells it to the world. But before, he's actually offering it to the Soviets first. So the back channel to me is more a reflection of what Kennedy is thinking than it says anything about the Soviets. And Khrushchev, yes, does use it to pollute the relationship in the summer of 1962. And one of Kennedy's mistakes was that this back channel was very dangerous in this regard. He didn't share. Bobby Kennedy rarely wrote up notes about the meetings. There are a few, but mostly he didn't. He just told his brother orally. And his brother didn't share this, not only with Dean Rusk, that's less important, but with John McCone, the head of the CIA. So the CIA analysts didn't know anything about what the Soviets were saying to the Kennedys in the back channel. And I assure you, because I've looked at this, which is that if the Soviet analysts had heard in August of 1962 that the Soviets were asking, that Khrushchev was asking the president not to undertake surveillance of their shipping, some pieces that hadn't been coming together would have come together. And I'll be very precise about this. There was a debate between the Pentagon and the CIA over the importance of these shipments. And Maxwell Taylor and the Pentagon said, doesn't matter. Even though these shipments were accelerating in the summer, the U.S. military wasn't that worried about them. The CIA said there's something weird here, that they're breaking precedent. If Maxwell Taylor and the Pentagon had heard that Khrushchev, in one of the few things, Khrushchev rarely asked for anything through the back channel, had actually asked for the United States to stop surveillance, I think that would have solved this debate in favor of saying, oh, this is a big deal. But Kennedy didn't share that with anybody, just he and his brother. So there are real dangers with back channels if you actually don't share the material with your foreign policy team. So that's as I said, it's fascinating about Kennedy, and I think it changes one's view of Kennedy, but it also shows the dangers of those kinds of operations. And in the end, I think it inured Khrushchev to believing what Bobby Kennedy said, so it had a good outcome. I think it made the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis in many ways possible, because when Bobby went to speak to Dobrynin and offers to remove the missiles from Turkey, the Soviets are accustomed to the brother of the president saying things that they're not hearing anywhere else and believing them.
Intriguing in light of certain presidential sons-in-law. Bob Zellick in the back there. Thank you.
So an observation and two questions. The observation is, the more I listen to the excellent presentations, the more I find my mind relating the experience not to relations with Russia today, but to other challenges, including North Korea. So for the conference organizers or those wrapping up, I urge you to expand the universe in which we apply this. The two questions. First, an old historical one. I've always been curious why the Soviets didn't make more of the fact of the removal of the Jupiter missiles from Turkey after they were removed. It would strike me in a public diplomacy or even a Khrushchev sense of self and ego, this would have given him an opportunity to say, look, I got a better deal than everybody expected, and the United States capitulated. The more current question goes to Tim's point about disruptors. How would you apply your insights to a situation with Korea today where we have two disruptors? We've got Kim Jong-un, we've got President Trump, and President Trump is not only disrupting on the Korean Peninsula, but I would argue he's disrupting the traditional American security economic order. And so you have a third player, which is the revisers in China. So they might like to have a revisionist of the order with two disruptors. So tell me what insights you have from that.
That's great. I'm going to share an argument. I had a good fortune to give a lecture about the Cuban Missile Crisis at the Air War University. So I got a chance to try out my little approach to North Korea there, because they don't want to hear about the Cuban Missile Crisis. They want to hear about North Korea for obvious reasons. I for my sins, and I'm a student of Ernest May's, like Philip Zellicoe, and I know to be very careful of analogies, because most of them are fraudulent and incomplete. But for my sins, I see the North Koreans as pufferfish. And now, of course, if I had clearances, and maybe we know that they're suicidal, but if you accept the proposition that they're not suicidal, you have to accept that proposition. Khrushchev is not suicidal. If you accept that proposition, and if you accept the proposition that they no longer believe it possible to invade South Korea, okay, and I'm positing those two things. I don't know them for sure. If you accept those propositions, then what we have here is the North Koreans reacting to the existential threat of the United States, and the very fact, and again, I'm not engaging in moral equivalence here, that the United States has viewed them publicly and said publicly that they are a threat to the international system. They're also an unstable dictatorship, and it is useful for them to have an enemy. And if you accept that, then you manage them differently. Then you see that they're not really a military threat to us. In fact, I think it's unlikely that they would ever attack Guam. I don't think they can actually target. I don't think they know for sure that if they launched a missile, it wouldn't hit Japan, and they don't want to hit Japan. So if you accept that, now you have to accept these propositions. Then this is an issue of deterrence. And you accept the fact that they have nuclear weapons, because they do. And you also, and we all know this, historically, nonproliferation hasn't worked with regard to countries that want nuclear weapons. The United States didn't want Israel to have nuclear weapons. There's a fantastic story, and it failed. The Israelis did what they felt they needed to, and they used denial and deception, and they achieved what they wanted. The United States didn't want India to have nuclear weapons. The Indians used denial and deception and got what they wanted. We didn't want Pakistan to have weapons. I mean, it goes on and on and on. The real achievement in international politics is when you can delay their acquisition of nuclear weapons. And you delay it long enough until the world sort of is ready to deal. And delaying Iran is a great achievement. So if you accept the proposition that North Korea has nuclear weapons and just treat them like a nuclear state, and then you deter them, and then the issue is how you deter them. I would like South Korea to deter them. I think extended deterrence is a mistake there, because it pulls us into a fight that's not our fight. I mean, really, North Korea doesn't matter to us. So let's let the South Koreans deter them, and then it's over. Let them deter each other, and you have nuclear weapons on both sides, and it's done. And we can pull away and deal with the South China Sea, which is our problem. So that's how that's my lesson from.
Just a little further, you talked about the North Korean destruction. What's different in this case, your deterrence theory might work if you didn't have a disruptor. When you have two disruptors. The American disruptor, this is a different kind of containment. In the Cold War, we dealt with containing another power. Here, we're talking about containing the president, and
Alfred.
One hopes that Mattis
Alfred.
and others will.
No.
But yes, his rhetoric is only inflaming. If you accept my view of why the North Koreans act the way they do, there couldn't be anything worse than the approach that our current president is taking with Pyongyang.
Mel.
So, Tim, I always like to say that I love when sessions are provocative, and I'll say that you provoked me. So, so I agree with what I think was your basic conclusion, that adversaries are more rational than we think, and other nations are afraid of us. But I don't think that you frame this entire issue appropriately. I really don't. And I think it is illuminated by the fact that you keep saying, Khrushchev said, Berlin, Berlin, Berlin. Actually, when Khrushchev wrote to Kennedy and talked to Kennedy at Vienna, he did not say Berlin, Berlin, Berlin. He said, Germany, 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 Germany. Let me talk to you about Germany. Let me tell you why we believe Germany is such a threat. Let me explain to you what it was like during World War II. Let me tell you what it was like to be in Ukraine and to experience German occupation. Let me tell you about the way we perceive the evolution of West German power. I won't tell you, but I'm really afraid of the fact that West Germany is a magnet to East Germany. I'm really afraid of the prospect that West Germany may acquire nuclear weapons. These were all fundamental issues that undergirded Khrushchev's motives. So when you say Khrushchev is a disruptor, and you just use that as the sort of way to characterize him, you simplify and you trivialize. And what's even more important is that it raises the whole question about, did Kennedy really understand adversaries' interests? Maybe he did. Maybe he did, but he wasn't willing to accommodate them. I'm not saying that he should have, but there is a real confrontation here of vital interests. And the notion moreover, that you say Americans did not think adversaries, weaker adversaries, would be risk takers, I think elides the major issue you said at the beginning. Oh, we really need to talk about Korea. So the overriding lesson of Korea was that we Americans must build up military capabilities so that no competitor in the world in the future will take risks. We will have a preponderance of power, to use a famous phrase, we will have a preponderance of power to deter future risk-taking. And so much of American policy all through the 1950s was about how much power do we really need to have to deter risk-taking? And if risk-taking should take place, how much power do we need to have, and what sorts of military capabilities do we need to have to dominate an escalatory crisis? I would like you to respond to those issues and to reflect on whether that should help us re-understand this context and its implications.
Well, it's fun to provoke. I think, Mel, I think I see that we have a fundamentally different approach to this, because I give Khrushchev more agency in this story. I maybe because of my generation, or the fact that all this detail came out and I got lost in it and enjoyed it. But I see the Soviets as making choices and Khrushchev making choices. And I found that the people, that analyses that made the United States more significant in these outcomes were skewed by the fact that U.S. documents had existed when people were writing these books. And that may be unfair, but I don't see this as the Russians dealing with an American world. I see the Russians making their own choices. And to go to the details, to answer you with detail, the pen pal letters. These were these letters that were sent between the Soviets and the Americans, between Khrushchev and Kennedy, starting in September of 1961. They're really boring, but they're interesting for us because it's all about trying to seek on the American side some kind of agreement that would make the Soviets feel secure. And it's all about Berlin. It's the details of what it is the Soviets are ultimately seeking in Berlin. And the Americans draw a line. The one thing that Kennedy cannot agree with is the removal of NATO. And for Khrushchev, that is a sine qua non for an agreement. So yes, about the feeling about World War II, in the sense that, although Kennedy didn't need to be lectured about World War II, but Kennedy's all about trying to seek an understanding with the Soviets. And they go into great detail. This drives the French mad, by the way. The French do not even want to participate in these discussions. I mean, there's all this back and forth between Paris and Washington over whether to get into detail about Berlin. So if the United States was blind to Khrushchev's needs and interests, I don't think you would see these detailed negotiations. Now, they failed in the end because the Americans couldn't go to where the Soviets wanted to go. Now, I respect you enormously, and there's an element, you raised one other point that has nothing to do with Berlin that is also important to the Soviets, and that's West German acquisition of nuclear weapons. And there, I believe the Americans did screw up. Because the Americans came up with the multinational force in an effort to try to to find a way to make the French happy, because the French wanted nuclear weapons, the United States didn't want them to have nuclear weapons, and to somehow tamp down, it's more Bavarian, really, than German desires. It's, well, Strauss's desires for nuclear weapons. This was a European-centered approach, which had unintended consequences with Moscow, because what Moscow saw was that this was a proliferation of nuclear weapons within NATO. There I agree. It's an unintended consequence. But in the pen pal letters, which I think set the stage for Khrushchev's decision-making and risk-taking in '62, they're talking about the details of Berlin, and I think so. I think Berlin is really important. But you know what? Historians disagree. It's part of the fun of our business.
A somewhat more narrower point. It sounds, Tim, as if you're saying de Gaulle's advice would apply to North Korea. And sort of connected to that, I'm wondering, in retrospect, to what extent Eisenhower came close in his dealings with Khrushchev to taking de Gaulle's advice compared to Kennedy. To be sure, Eisenhower did let himself be pressured into having the visit to the United States by Khrushchev and the summit in Paris in April 1960 because he was worried. But I don't think Eisenhower produced the same impression on Khrushchev as the Bay of Pigs and Kennedy's behavior at the summit in Vienna, which you didn't take all that seriously. That is, I think Kennedy did strike Khrushchev as a kind of immature young man who might be pushed around in ways that Eisenhower, with all of his seniority, maturity, and military background, might not.
I don't think you should ever debate with a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer. Bill, all I'll say is that in the transcripts of the Politburo sessions, Khrushchev describes Kennedy as being the same as Eisenhower. So I mean, we could have this discussion offline about why people are convinced that Khrushchev had this view. But in the materials that were released in 2002 and 2003, I didn't see evidence of him saying that Kennedy is this immature guy we can't take seriously. I think Khrushchev had this bizarre view of the American system where he saw structures as more important than individuals, so he was interested in Wall Street and the Pentagon, and the issue for him was who was strong enough to deal with Wall Street and the Pentagon. It's a fool's game to debate with such a brilliant biographer. But I saw data that led me in a different direction. With regard to North Korea, yeah, I think given that North Korea is not the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was a threat to us militarily, and therefore I think that behooved engagement. I mean, that was the argument for engagement. North Korea is not that important. That I think letting the South Koreans engage and finding a way to make South Korea the source of deterrence is a better idea. But as Mr. Zellick pointed out, we have two disruptors simultaneously, and our first objective should be to somehow contain or persuade the American disruptors so that he doesn't keep ratcheting up the volume.
Frank, and this will be, I think, so Alfred, if you could come forward for Frank here has a question. This will be our last question because we want to leave equal time for the second half of our panel. And while we're getting ready for that question, on the Eisenhower point, I did make eye contact with my colleague Will Hitchcock, who waved me off, but I am recommending his forthcoming book this March on Eisenhower, which will be the definitive work, I believe, on the 34th president. So everyone prepare for that.
What do I do about the microphone?
Microphone is right here for you.
Yeah, I just want to very briefly follow up Mel's question to you, Tim, about Khrushchev being a disruptor with regard to Berlin. You know, as we all know, East Germany was the crown jewel of the Soviet Empire, and they were losing that crown jewel as there was emigration of particularly the most talented, educated people leaving East Germany through Berlin and to the west. And we know that. And the Berlin Wall inelegantly, brutally solved that problem, and the Berlin crisis dissipated shortly after that. I mean, in terms of being a disruptor, it seems to me that Khrushchev was trying to defend his position rather than disrupting it.
Well, since and I'm sorry I didn't mention Will's book, because Will is the one who will tell us what Eisenhower was really thinking and whether he actually liked de Gaulle enough to take his advice. I don't agree with you about Berlin. The Berlin crisis did not end in 1961. I know that's the standard view, but the Soviet materials make clear that for Khrushchev, it didn't end. And you have to just keep in mind that he wants a change in the nature of the settlement in Central Europe, and he wants it in 62. And he makes it clear to the Presidium that he wants it in 62. The question is the tactics. In the beginning of 62, he says, we have time. We can leave this aside. But in the meantime, we have to deter American power. And then in the summer of 1962, after the Cubans accept the missiles, the Soviet decision-making system was first among equals. Khrushchev was clearly more powerful than anybody else, but the others were not all ciphers. And Anastas Mikoyan is really important because he calmed Khrushchev down. The Soviet leadership was surprised by Khrushchev's suggestion of putting missiles in Cuba, which he came up with himself when he was in Bulgaria. And they wanted to slow him down. And so the Presidium, which normally didn't take 2 days to make a decision, took 2 days to make this decision, and said, we will do this if the Cubans want it. Well, the Cubans were surprised. The Cubans are surprised. And when the Cubans say yes, Khrushchev gets very excited because he sees the opportunity to actually put pressure on the United States and maybe achieve those changes in Central Europe that he was seeking. And you see in the materials of the Soviet Foreign Ministry in the summer of 1962, the preparation for what I feel is sort of if you remember the old mousetrap game, this leads to that, to this to that. The Soviets were setting up for a phenomenal moment at the United Nations where Khrushchev would make a speech and where he would threaten war with the United States if there wasn't a new settlement in Berlin. And he was doing that on the basis of his knowledge that he would have nuclear weapons in Cuba at that time to pose a real threat to the American homeland. So if Berlin had been solved, in his mind, in 61, I don't see how these events would have occurred as they did in 62. This is not to say the United States wasn't involved in provoking the Soviets, but I think we don't give enough agency to Khrushchev. He is making decisions not always in response to an American action. I think he often makes decisions in response to the existence of the United States.
Yeah, and I would just add to follow up, one of my big takeaways from your work on Khrushchev is that regarding Berlin versus Cuba and the rationale for the deployment of the missiles, Khrushchev is saying different things to those different levels within the hierarchy. That to the first-tier officials, he is talking about Berlin, and this is part of the gearing up. But to the second-tier officials, doesn't necessarily mean it's the secondary reason, but it's probably gravitating in that direction. Those are the people who are hearing more about the Cuba rationale for the missiles themselves, protecting the revolution.
I think it's spin. I think the Cuba rationale is spin that comes out later because he's trying to explain why he did this. The other thing, the question about why he doesn't take credit, that's a great question. And I know why he doesn't take credit initially because the Americans say to him, if you say anything about the Turkish deal, it won't happen. And then in 64, he's out. Why he doesn't take credit in his memoirs, I don't understand. Those memoirs, as you know, as Strobe, he's in the back, knows better than anybody here. He does. But at length? No. Because I mean, he does recognize it, but I mean, because the Chinese and the Cubans were vicious in attacking him for the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you'd think, because he's quite repetitive in these, in his memoirs, that he would have really gone to town against them, saying, you know, I just couldn't tell them what had I achieved. And he doesn't do that, and I can't explain why. But maybe Strobe has an explanation.
Well, we could spend the next half going back over this material, but please join me in thanking Tim and Mark, and we'll move on to our second. So with that, we will call, thank you so much, we'll call Jeremy and Vlad to the table, please.
Good job, sir. Nice job, Mark. How are you?
Could I ask everyone now to take a seat so we can start with our second half of our panel? Tim? Tim, can I have you take a seat? And we'll get started since we're a little bit behind on our second half of our panel. May I have everyone please take a seat? This is our second half of this panel. We will go to a little bit past 1. I have just met Vlad Zubak last evening over dinner and after dinner, in which we had a fascinating conversation about Khrushchev and Kennedy, but two slightly different Khrushchevs and Kennedys about whom we've been speaking, and it was Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy and Mrs. Khrushchev. And we might save that for a later discussion, but I really enjoyed that conversation. Vlad is a professor of international history at the London School of Economics. He's an expert on the Cold War and Soviet-Russian history, and particularly intellectual history. Among his books is particularly related to our topic of this conference, A Failed Empire, the Soviet Union in the Cold War, from Stalin to Gorbachev. And I also noted among his books Zhivago's Children. And having just watched the movie yet again, Dr. Zhivago, I was drawn, of course, to that topic. Jeremy Suri is a longtime friend of the Miller Center, and we're always happy to welcome him back, as we did recently for an American Forum on his latest book, The Impossible Presidency, which in light of the incumbent might be called The Impossible President, but it is called The Impossible Presidency, and of course it is about whether anyone now can be a successful president. Jeremy is the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership and Global Affairs at the University of Texas, and he is based in both the Department of History and the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs. So I'm going to turn to Vlad first, who will speak to us about his essay on Brezhnev and the lessons of détente.
All right. Should I go there?
You may go wherever you are comfortable.
All right. Maybe I'll stay. And for everybody says I'll be brief, so I will try to be brief in reality, which doesn't mean, when we think about Brezhnev, of course, we're struck by the fact that such an individual with threadbare education, no ability to conceptualize international relations, all of a sudden came up with an idea of détente and it succeeded for at least for a while in that enterprise. It's useful actually to compare Brezhnev to Khrushchev, because Brezhnev succeeded Khrushchev, and Khrushchev is the last person, as we heard so much from Tim, and the person who represents heroic Bolshevik tradition. That is, let's take by Sturm und Drang the existing capitalist system, and he believes in the revolution and all that. Bill wrote a beautiful biography of him. He was a true believer. But if you ask yourself why there was only one Khrushchev, truly, in the history of the Cold War. There were no imitators of Khrushchev's before him, and certainly there were no willing imitators of Khrushchev after him, which is easier to understand. And then you come up with a more sort of normative picture of Soviet foreign policy, where most of people, even Stalin, at many points of his career, and certainly people after Stalin's death, begin to search for some kind of Soviet American détente, or some kind of a conceptual system, structure that would accommodate both Soviet and American interests. So that, makes Khrushchev a colorful, but only an episode, a heroic episode in this search for accommodation between the two great powers. And for Brezhnev personally, whatever Khrushchev did was quite awful, especially in foreign policy. And it was just as a reaction, and sometimes purely visceral reaction, to Khrushchev's risk-taking, that Brezhnev supported something opposite to what Khrushchev did. And he kept repeating that that guy brought us to the brink of the war. So Brezhnev's idea of détente, I won't go through all these things, was very, very simplistic. It was not a Kantian perpetual peace idea, but it was deeply held idea that if you have two great powers, they're big, they have nuclear weapons, they can destroy each other. What prevents them actually from reaching some kind of an agreement to stabilize, to build a stable world order? So for Brezhnev, it's absolutely logical that sooner or later that should happen. The only problem is that some people in the United States, some military-industrial complex, and here Brezhnev does not really understand much what is out there, something prevents on the American side this idea from being realized. And then all of a sudden he finds a partner with whom he can negotiate, reach results, and also, very importantly, negotiate from a position of strength, because he does believe in strength. That's Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon comes to power in 1969. Very good year for Brezhnev, because he just managed to deal with a huge crisis in Eastern Europe with Czechoslovakia, and he's a falling domino man. He says, had we not invaded Czechoslovakia, or rather he put it differently, of course, not invaded, saved, Czechoslovakia, then of course NATO troops would soon end up immediately on our western borders. That resonates with today Putin's thinking. So he's a more normal Soviet man to me than Khrushchev. And there are many more Brezhnevs in the Soviet political establishment than they were Khrushchev. Khrushchev is pretty unique, actually, if you think about it. However, when you look at Brezhnev's détente and its fate, and you begin to realize that this détente hit its limitations very soon, in a few years. It's definitely, by 1975, everyone understands something went wrong. This is not only Jackson-Vanik Amendment, this is, many other things piling up. My argument is very, very simple. Brezhnev's idea, not only Brezhnev's idea, the idea of huge number of Soviet nomenclatura, communist officials, mostly Russians, but also Ukrainians and others, that there could be some inevitable a conceptual framework where the two powers would form a stable world order, was based on delusion and fundamental misperception of what America is about and how America wanted to build the world with U.S. leadership and only U.S. leadership. So when Brezhnev meets Nixon, who is already, half drunk, in the Watergate stage, that's in Crimea, and that's their last meeting, he raises a toast to the doctrine of lasting and universal peace, the Nixon-Brezhnev doctrine. Right. That's a joke, but there's something deeper behind this joke. So I would have argued that Brezhnev could never fully realize that a US-Soviet world order is an oxymoron. American elites never, ever wanted to create such a world order. They wanted to prevail in the Cold War. And the United States did offer strategic alliance to a big communist country, but it was China, not the Soviet Union. And they offered that alliance to China because it's explicitly then geostrategically directed against the Soviet Union. Now I'm moving to Putin. Putin is a very different person than Khrushchev, but it is also a very different person in comparison to Brezhnev. There's some similarities, there's some differences. Let's go through them for those who didn't have a chance to read the paper. Putin, like Brezhnev, is deeply illiberal. He respects force, he supports militarism, he venerates great fatherland war, very much like Brezhnev did, and he promotes state patrimonialism. To reduce Putin to a KGB man is a height of primitivism. I think most of American press does it, but it's deeply wrong. He had a steep learning curve. He learned a lot. What does it mean when the state is destroyed? And Russia was flooded by highly unpleasant realities linked to political and economic liberalization. So he accepted fundamental failure of communism as economic and ideological doctrine. He does not want to rebuild a territorial Soviet empire. His project is to improve Russia's place in the existing world order, not to create a new one. And here comes the rub. You know, if you think about it, and if you talk to very knowledgeable Russians, I just had an exchange with one of them over email recently. Even they don't understand why Russia cannot find a proper model, a place for itself in the world. Sometimes Russia acts as if it's a superpower, but everyone understands that Russia cannot be a superpower for economic and other reasons. It just doesn't have enough oomph for that, right? And then Russia refuses to act as a regional power because it's allegedly something self-diminishing and derogatory. So Russia is somewhere. The relationship of Russia to the existing liberal order is not an easy thing to establish. And just in terms of provoking a discussion, I would argue that it's highly dichotomous. On one hand, the entire stability of Putin's, let's call it Putin's state, Putin's regime, depends on macroeconomic stability and export-import relationship with the liberal global order. Nothing better exists, and nothing better that Russia can certainly build or aspire to. The past years proved how good this order was for Russia, considering limitations of its economy and wealth of its raw materials. It's a wonderful system, but not enough, because you come to the idea of bad neighborhood, you come to the idea of constant, the forces coming from the East, and of course from China as well, threatening to chip away what you consider to be your backyard, what you consider to be your own buffer zone, and so on and so forth. And you're the leader. In the patrimonial authoritarian system where Putin is a king, everything is absolutely interdependent. If you yield on the foreign front, all your rivals and opponents domestically see, aha, you're weak. So Putin cannot afford to be weak. When he has to show flexibility, for instance, he couldn't take Novorossiya, he just took Crimea. He had to stop for obvious reasons. But he must compensate for that apparent sign of weakness by doing something else. He goes to Syria. He cannot just stay idle and not respond to Western sanctions. He must produce counter-sanctions. That's part of the regime that he is as hostage of as the creator of. So what does it leave us with? I do think that still, if we go beyond this complexity, dealing with the system itself, structural limitations, and Putin's own psyche, this is the country, again, that is fundamentally different from the Soviet Union. Putin has some weaknesses, but some strengths in comparison to Brezhnev. Brezhnev was responsible for a sprawling communist empire, allies in Ethiopia and Angola, Vietnam and all that, he had to maintain. Putin at least can choose, more or less, where to intervene and how far to go. Also, in terms of economic flexibility, yes, Russian economy is smaller than the Soviet economy, but Putin at least did not inherit a completely failed economic model. He still employs neoliberal economists that provide quite efficiently macroeconomic stability when the pie is shrinking, even under the conditions of sanctions. So this is a flexibility Brezhnev could not even dream of. Politburo was very conservative, very cautious when it came to the budget and the control of the state bank. But the Politburo had no idea how to do when you have a major crisis, falling oil prices and all that. Putin knows, not he personally, Nabiullin and other people that he employs, knows how to react to volatility, and that's strength. In terms of propaganda, Brezhnev's propaganda was a joke. It was a joke for us, so Soviet citizens who were inside. Basically, the propaganda mean that everything that the Soviet propaganda says, you have to turn upside down, and this is the truth. Russian propaganda today, this is again something that Brezhnev's Soviet Union could not even possibly dream of. With all my respect, RT is a very successful enterprise. And Russian operations in social networks using American platforms like Facebook and Twitter and others, is phenomenal. I don't know if it stay this way, but it's a phenomenal achievement. So to overestimate Putin's strength, no, of course. We know that Russia is weak and getting weaker, but underestimate Putin is also a wrong thing, and say, well, let it go down, and the United States can ignore it. It's we cannot ignore it. Finally, let me conclude with an optimistic note. Crimea is an exception. It's a one-off thing. Putin does not need more territory. If only because more people come with the territory, you have to feed them and give pensions and so on and so forth. He doesn't like it. Putin's strategy was and is not a confrontation with the West, but a bargain. We all know it. The problem is that the American side does not want to provide him that opportunity. Perhaps for Putin, it was as much of a grand illusion or a grand delusion as détente was for Brezhnev.
Thank you, Thad.
Well done.
And now Jeremy, we'll turn to Jeremy, whose essay is on Nixon and détente.
Well, I just want to start by, again, thanking the organizers and also say how delighted I am to be up here with Barbara and Vlad. I've used so much of the work from the Presidential Studies Project here at the Miller Center. I think it's one of the most important things that not just the Miller Center does, that the historical profession has done in the last decade or so. And I want to applaud the Miller Center and hope that the Presidential Studies Project continues to prosper in coming years. I know my graduate students will benefit from it, as many of us will. And I want to just tell everyone how influenced I've been by Vlad's work, in many ways because Vlad does what almost no other historian, I think, of the period of détente does, which is to not simply tell the story of détente, but to contextualize it within the broader framework, writing about both the role of Soviet leaders, but also Soviet citizens like himself. Zhivago's children, as Barbara referred to the book before. That's my point of departure. Because I think one of the problems in studying détente and one of the big problems in teaching détente to undergraduates is, first of all, I don't know what it is. It's very hard to define. And there's a tendency we have to describe détente in hyper-elitist terms, focusing on a few individuals and not understanding the context in which this transformative moment takes shape on both sides and the reasons why it fails to be an enduring transformation, of course. The closest I've been able to come, in Nixon's words, in describing what he thought about détente is the speech I quote in the paper from the U.S. Naval Academy in June of '74. And I'm just going to read it to get us started. I'm not going to read anything else. But I want to read that quote just to give us a framework for what we're talking about, so we all know what the subject is here that we're discussing. Nixon explained, this is at the height of Watergate, a blend of the ideal and the pragmatic in our foreign policy has been especially critical in our approach to the Soviet Union. The differences between our two systems of life and government are sharp and fundamental. But even as we oppose totalitarianism, and it's interesting he uses that phrase, we must also keep sight of the hard, cold facts of life in the nuclear age. Ever since the Soviet Union achieved equality in strategic weapons systems, each confrontation has meant a brush with potential nuclear devastation to all civilized nations. And Mark and Tim gave us a wonderful description of that moment when that really becomes clear. Reduction of tensions, therefore, between us has become the foremost requirement of American foreign policy. Nixon and Kissinger, and I think they came to this thinking independently, they both believed that the global order that had benefited the United States so much since World War II was diminishing in its benefits to the United States. I think it overstates it to say that they thought it was completely crumbling. But they thought that the trends in the global world system, economic, political, military, were moving against American predominance. They saw a crisis of the old order, and they acutely, Nixon in particular, acutely felt it at home. This was the story of Nixon's electoral career in the 1960s, and the story of what actually got him elected was in large part the crisis of American politics in 1968. And it's not just the 2016 election where a candidate draws an inside straight to get elected. That happened in 1968 as well. I think if you ran the 1968 election 5 more times, Nixon would not win it more than 1 or 2 other times. That election could go so many different ways. A few different words from Humphrey about Vietnam a little earlier. Perhaps, as we're learning, in fact, thanks to the research being done at the Miller Center, perhaps a little less interference in the negotiations over Vietnam, and perhaps that election comes out differently. Another week, and it comes out differently. Nixon was acutely conscious, as I think our president is today, of how precarious his power was at home. And he believed, I think, and this comes through in all of his writings about détente, that establishing stability overseas was crucial for his political longevity at home. These were deeply interconnected. And I wrote a whole book arguing this, and of course I keep finding more evidence to reinforce that. So, what Nixon placed the most emphasis on, and this shows up even before he's president, in his notes thinking about foreign policy, is the role of the individual and the personal role which he and those around him, i.e. Henry Kissinger and a few others, must play in controlling this decline, in holding back. Kissinger gives it sort of very pedantic terms. For Nixon, I think it's actually quite pedestrian, that the silent majority has been silenced, the elites are taking us in the wrong direction, and I must stand up against these elites and push things in the direction that they should go. And perhaps that the leaders of the Soviet Union and China themselves, not respected by perhaps their own elites in their own societies, might follow along as well. There's a hyper-personalization of the understanding of diplomacy and foreign policy by Nixon and those around him. The centralization of power in the White House, the use of secrecy, the writing out of the State Department, that is not simply domestic politics, that is the mirror image at home of the view of the international system. They are deeply interconnected. It is not one or the other for them. And Richard Nixon is acutely conscious of the fact that the last president to manage stable relations with the Soviet Union was Franklin Roosevelt, and that Franklin Roosevelt did it in a very personalistic way. I think many of the things that Frank Castiglione has written about, Nixon recognized himself. If Eisenhower was to some extent his first model for thinking about diplomacy, Roosevelt was his model. And from the beginning, Nixon places emphasis upon doing what presidents in the Cold War had not done before, seeking to meet with the Soviets even when there isn't an agreed agenda. The most extreme example of this is the Nixon trip to China, the only presidential trip I know of where there isn't an agenda when you get on the ground when the president arrives. He doesn't know when he's going to meet with Mao. He doesn't know if he's going to meet with Mao. He doesn't know what's going to happen. No one would staff the president that way today. He doesn't go quite to that extent with the Soviets, but there is a similar desire in what he thinks are Rooseveltian terms to meet with the other side, to sit down, as he said, and talk things through man to man. And that phrase turns up time and again. The perception that the elites are the effete, feminized individuals, and these are the men who are going to sit down and figure things out. Nixon meets, of course, with his Soviet counterpart more times in his relatively short presidency than throughout the entire decade before. Right? So Kennedy and Johnson each have one meeting with a Soviet counterpart. Nixon has three. His meetings are more extensive. They're much more focused upon personal interrelations. They're much more secretive also. There's an emphasis upon making these relationships nimble. And there's an emphasis, and this is very important, upon negotiation. And again, in what Nixon sees as Rooseveltian terms, that everything is negotiable and that you can make trade-offs. Kissinger gives this the fancy terminology linkage. But I think anyone who has studied negotiations just recognizes this is the sort of horse trading that goes on in any serious negotiation. This drives the arms control experts batty, because they have figured out systematically the way to talk about throw weights, the way to talk about ABMs, and for Nixon and Kissinger, the technical stuff doesn't matter. It's all politics. It's all politics, right? So they intentionally disregard Gerard Smith and all the others who are coming to them and spent years thinking this through. It's a disdain for expertise, but it's also a belief in Clausewitzian terms that it's all politics. It's all politics. It's all about making trade-offs. That's what SALT is. That's what the ABM treaty is. That's what the Prevention of Nuclear War treaty is. There's an effort to use these negotiations and these personal relationships to then build a structure for stability, not the other way around. Not the other way around. There's a distrust in the structural factors and the trends and a desire to use the individuals to redefine those trends. And again, Kissinger can give this a very sort of German romantic sensibility that you're standing out and redefining your zeitgeist. It's simply about trying to redefine the pressures around you by building personal relationships as a foundation for new structural agreements. That's why you have the Agreement on Basic Principles in 1972. That's why you have these extensive discussions that actually occupy much of their time about what a stable world order system should look like. And I think at the base of it, Nixon's insight is that many of the problems of the Cold War can be managed better if you have more, and here I'm going to use Thomas Schelling's phrase, more common knowledge. That they know what we know and we know what they know. And we respect each other and recognize what we know on both sides. Common knowledge, understandings. Years ago, I actually did a word search in some of the documents, and the word understanding comes up more often than anything else. We have to build understandings. We must understand each other. We must understand each other by not talking to our area experts, but just talking direct, face to face. To understand intentions, understand the rules of the game, to create a stability based upon a common knowledge set for operating as a society. I would argue that to some extent, what Nixon does actually is successful. I'm with many scholars like Matt Evangelista and others, and Vlad Zubak, who think that the 1970s did have enduring changes. I don't think you can understand the Gorbachev generation, and I think this comes through in Bill's wonderful biography of Gorbachev. You can't understand that generation. You can't understand the new thinkers. Robert English writes about this as well, without understanding this period and the ways in which these personal relations broke down some of the barriers, some of the ideological barriers to contact between societies. The exchanges that arise, scientific exchanges. Alan Lynch has written about this in the field of international relations. The ways in which East and West, due to the personal relationships, not to fundamental agreements on ideology, but the personal relationships of the leaders, open space, give legitimacy, give cover to those who have long wanted to communicate across societies. And we do have a more stable world. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if our president today, if we had some sense of what his common knowledge about nuclear weapons was? Wouldn't that make the world a more stable place? Right? There is something about building common knowledge for strategic stability. We take it for granted as scholars because we think we know what we know and policymakers should know what we know. But often that's not the case. So there is a sense of strategic stability and a new communicative connection that I think is built during this period that has enormous enduring value. I'd put out there, and I read Bill's biography of Gorbachev saying this, he might disagree, but I think no détente, no Gorbachev. I think no détente, no Gorbachev. Where else is he going to have the opportunity to travel the way he does? Where else is Yakovlev going to have the chance to spend time in Canada and then spend time in the United States, hate the United States, but see Canadian social democracy and Spanish social democracy and Scandinavian social democracy as an alternative? Those connections matter enormously for these societies. I think they matter for American society as well. I think the quality of our study of the Soviet Union and the quality of advice that people like Reagan and others are getting is actually much improved in the 1980s because of the exchanges that arise in the 1970s. That said, those successes, I think, come with many failures that actually have to do less with individuals. The strength of Nixon and Kissinger as policymakers is their overwhelming energy, deep thought, and ability to pursue risky but important initiatives. Their weaknesses are all the same things. They do not know how to operate effectively in institutions. They are not institution builders. I would even call them at times institution disruptors. And they systematically undermine consensus for everything they do every step of the way. One way of thinking about it is Kissinger is a brilliant bull in a china shop. Wins over people on the other side, but manages to piss off everyone on his own side, every step of the way. The problem for détente on the U.S. side is it is not a process in the American policy system. It is not brought into the American policy system. The Pentagon and the State Department are pursuing entirely different sets of policies at the same time that the White House is pursuing a devoted, focused détente policy, and that is by design, and that is never reconciled. Henry Jackson just takes advantage of that. He's not the policy entrepreneur. He just sees that and takes advantage of it. The staffing is very poor. It's dependent upon very few people. And when those people leave the scene, as happens in 1974, it's very hard to continue, very hard to keep it going. This is actually the Roosevelt to Truman problem as well. Precisely the Roosevelt to Truman problem there. And most deeply of all, and perhaps most important for us today, it is not, the détente policy is not connected to American values. It's actually marketed, discussed, pursued as an alternative to American values. In fact, there's a deep self-criticism of the United States built into it. For all the discussion of the silent majority, Nixon and Kissinger believe that Americans don't understand the world, never will understand the world, and should just let them do it. And that is unsellable as policy in the United States in the long run. What effective policy needs, and now I'm speaking to the present world, I don't think I have much to offer in how to understand Vladimir Putin. We're all making this up, right? But I think what understanding the process of American policy making from this period can offer today is actually a point that Phil Zelikow has made recently that I want to build on: the importance of staffing, the importance of actually having institutional gravity behind what you do. Too much of our approaches to Russia and other major powers have batted back and forth from administration to administration and have actually, within administrations, and Derek's book makes this point for the Obama administration, within administrations have been divided, uncertain, inconsistent. Did we pivot to Asia? Did we not pivot to Asia? Did we reset with Russia? Did we not reset with Russia? I think building a consistent staffing structure and a set of institutional priorities that can back up the policies you're pursuing is absolutely essential. The point of my more recent book on the impossible presidency is that presidents take on policy making themselves and policy implementing themselves, and it never works. It never works. So we are doing exactly the wrong things today. I want to be on record on that. Without saying a word about Donald Trump, we're doing the wrong things today. We need more diplomats, not less. We need more diplomats, not less. We need more area experts, not less. And we need to be talking more, not less, and I don't mean at the presidential or White House level. Let me make this as clear as I can. White House policy making is doomed to failure. Foreign policy must be made in an interagency framework. It must involve the State Department and the Defense Department as well as the NSC, and there is no substitute for that for long-term effective policy. Détente, in the end, failed, at least on the American side, because it lacked that. And anything we're doing with Russia now is going to fail regardless of what Vladimir Putin does until we actually build that interagency structure. And everything I see us doing is just the opposite. So before we even talk about Putin, let's get our own house in order. And I think as historians we have a lot to offer for how we should think about that. Thank you.
Vlad, did you want to respond, or and you were busily making notes? Anything to say before we open up to questions?
No, let's open the
Okay, let's do. Alfred, we have one here in the middle, and then we have Svetlana after that.
Thank you. Thanks for very interesting and stimulating discussion. The Soviet/Russian leaders have longevity in the office that the American counterparts normally don't have. And when you look at Brezhnev, it's of course Johnson, and it's Nixon and Carter, and our focus is on Nixon. Carter and Johnson somehow got lost in our story. And my question is about the fate and the failure of detente, and to what degree the arrival of Carter and very new American policy and Brezhnev's stroke really contributed to that. So again, the question is about the importance of personalities in that story. How much emphasis you would put on personalities in the end of detente?
When I wrote about Brezhnev, I was struck how much it was his personality and his own set of beliefs, but also how lucky he was. And that brings us to structural factors and functional factors. I mean, he had Willy Brandt with his Ostpolitik. He had, Nixon, who was an ideal American president in Soviet imagination. Everything is run through Kissinger. Everything is secretive. Everything is decided through back channel. Where U.S. Secretary of State Rogers doesn't even know about this back channel. It's perfect way how you can run business in Soviet imagination. So that luck couldn't last, obviously, and Brezhnev ran out of luck even before he had a stroke or whatever. He had illness right after Vladivostok. In Vladivostok, he meets with Ford, whom we never mention almost, right. But Ford is the first president who sort of sits, politely listens to Brezhnev, and basically has no imagination, power, or energy to do anything with détente, and goes back and says, no, I'm no longer use the word détente, by the way. So Brezhnev's own health, of course, deteriorated very rapidly. But also, as I interviewed Soviet participants who knew him, like Kornienko, for instance, Kornienko said, Brezhnev reacted very, very quickly to opportunities. He was a very astute politician in domestic setting and foreign setting, who, if he saw there is something to do with West Germany, he would go there as long as success is almost assured. In that way, he was absolutely opposite to Khrushchev. He was not a risk taker. He was more close to Stalin in a strange way. Stalin liked to do things when everything was prepared and assured, and he wouldn't take risk. So when he was sick, he also couldn't see any opportunities for himself. If he had one under Carter, he would have grabbed them. Unfortunately, Carter's idea, as we know in 1977, was a little bit misguided about how to renegotiate SALT. We all went through numerous discussions about it. It was very, very unfortunate that Americans changed that position. And this is something the Soviets also couldn't interiorize, that every U.S. administration starts from scratch, and it's a mess. You have to wait for a year, and then probably at the end of the second year of the first administration, they have a good chance. They would understand something about arms control and other issues. And then you use this very, very narrow window of opportunity to do something with Americans, and then the next presidential campaign starts. And it's hopeless. So I very much hear the pain of Soviet diplomats when Troyanovsky, the first ambassador to the United States, said that he made this famous comparison. Japan was like a chamber orchestra. When you knew every violin or cello and so on and so forth, and you could do diplomacy with that. But United States is unruly symphonic orchestra. That's a very generous, actually, image about the United States betraying his classical education. But the Soviets are continuously baffled by so many things about how Americans do their foreign policy. And of course, not only Americans. We know Kennan denied American ability to have foreign policy whatsoever. So,
Jeremy?
I think we can go to the next question.
All right, Svetlana, Alfred, Svetlana right here in the front.
My question is actually closely related. I found that very interesting, thought-provoking, the comparison Vlad made between when he said was Brezhnev's illusion or delusion about a possibility of the US-Soviet cooperative world order. And then you compared it to Putin's illusion or delusion in the beginning of first Putin's administration. Well, I never thought about it this way, but can I, this is really interesting, because maybe Putin also sincerely believed that a truly cooperative order was possible, world order. Now, can I push you just a little more to the moment where that illusion or delusion starts to dissipate, and why, and try to make the same comparison between Brezhnev and Putin? And this is not a question about personalities. This is a question about their vision of how world order might work, that it would be cooperative, and why it does not work this way. Is there any similarity?
Well, we all know this history after 9/11, when Putin calls Bush and offers all kinds of things, that's the strategic partnership of sorts, and he definitely acts at the time when there's already, how strong I don't know, but when there's already an anti-American consensus in Moscow political elites and foreign, and even among diplomats. Is more Primakovian kind of approach to foreign policy than Kozyrev type, right? And Putin overrules that, so that's the role of individual. He overrules it apparently in his belief that, heroic factor is important. As long as I reach out to American leader, our friendship would become the basis for the future partnership. And I'm quoting from your paper, Svetlana. I mean, it's like that between Clinton and Yeltsin. I mean, if we're friends, that's the best basis for partnership. And it never happens. It never happens in Soviet-American relation. That's a grand illusion, because there are other structural forces that the Soviets and then the Russians simply are incapable of understanding. Moreover, even scholars sometimes are incapable of understanding those impediments and those obstacles. They just think, it could have happened, it didn't, but for some reason it didn't. But then it becomes like the whole path of failures, and you still ask a question, why this failure? Why that failure? Maybe the conclusion should be like in a good science. It was not a failure. It was, закономерность. It was a pattern. It was almost a law. So then, of course, I think it was Iraq. I think it was Iraq when instead of doing what, instead of listening to the Russian concerns, but the Bush administration walks out of ABM treaty and invades Iraq. And those two things had huge impact on Moscow foreign policy elite. Huge impact.
Sorry.
Yeah, well,
no, I was just going to say on the American side, I think there's an interesting pattern of also delusion and disillusionment among presidents, right? I think presidents have a tendency to overstate their ability to persuade a foreign leader. They've gotten to power by persuading people within the country, and they overstate their ability to do that. I think it's what makes George H.W. Bush so interesting, because he was so modest, I think, about his ability to do that. But generally, presidents, from Kennedy forward, I think, I would even think perhaps Eisenhower, but Will might disagree. But presidents have a tendency, certainly Roosevelt as well, to believe they can persuade their foreign adversaries, and that they can persuade them and still do what they want to do. This comes back to Tim's point about not seeing how what we're doing is perceived as threatening by others. So I can build a relationship with you, right, as Boris, but yet I can go ahead and do what I'm doing, right, in other parts of the world that undermine Russian interests. And because Boris and I are friends, right, Bill and Boris can manage all these things, right? The problem is that, of course, foreign leaders are not persuaded as easily as we think they are, and they pay close attention to what we do outside of our personal relationships with them. It takes a long time for presidents to learn that.
Alfred, Philip Zelikow has a question.
Yeah, I think the very good discussion is actually not generous enough to Soviet foreign policy. In this period, Jeremy made the point how we would do better if we built up our institutions and did high-quality policy work. I know of no period in which almost any government in the post-war era did a better job of institutional, high-quality policy staff work than the Soviet government in the 1970s. This is not so much about Brezhnev. This is now the people like Kornienko and Dobrinin, and you look at the skill for, just to take, for example, the Americans, we haven't talked much about Vietnam. The Americans during this period are totally hamstrung by their position on Vietnam and their need in every negotiation to try to get the Soviets to try to help them manage their Vietnam problem. And Dobrinin and his team managed that issue about, frankly, if you look back on it, could they have managed it any better? And, you know, if you kind of like, if you ask yourself, what were their purposes and how did they want to kind of skillfully manage this and to get to what outcomes? Could they have done any better than they did? And then if you could go almost from region to region to region, and again, according to the objectives that they had in the 70s, their logic, it's really quite a remarkable performance from an institutional point of view. And sometimes you could even notice that beneath Putin and maybe including Putin, Russian foreign policy over the last few years has actually developed and implemented rather skillfully composed plans that obtained the strategic initiative and outmaneuvered their rivals in ways we might not like, but that say something about somebody doing some staff work. Like the move into Syria, there's months of sophisticated staff work involved with both the Syrians and the Iranians. That's a prelude to what the Americans begin seeing in 2015. Just as one illustration. Nor did the stuff with Crimea and Ukraine sort of happen on a 24-hour impulse with no advanced planning. So I just invite you a little bit, Vlad, to, it's not so much an attack on Nixon and Kissinger per se, though I agree with Jeremy's comments, is to step back and actually observe, in a way, Moscow foreign policy in a light more flattering than you get from focusing on the senescent supreme leader.
Well, there were, at least as far as I can see, three approaches to the United States from the end of the 50s to the end of the 70s. One was I would say, bad sociology approach that was surprisingly present even, let's say, in the early 80s, considered to be completely obsolete, but of course present. The approach that was popularized by the former Soviet ambassador, Smiling Mike Menshikov, that there's a pyramid of power consisting of the Wall Street and all kinds of groupings that fight for influence and money around it, and there are groups of monopolistic capitalists and blah blah blah. That's bad sociology, right? Mills for you, in a Soviet kind of incarnation of it. And it was very much present. So from, I guess, the opposite viewpoint, and quite linked to what Jeremy and I have discussed about individuals, was the point that I discovered in Arbatov's institute, ISKCON. Arbatov and all his younger proteges told me right away, and I came that my mind was quite clouded by that bad sociology, I should admit, when I came to ISKCON, and said, just throw out all this rubbish. Everything is about individuals. Everything is about personal, diplomatic, and cultural relations. We need to have more exchanges. We need to have more exhibitions, American Soviet exhibitions, and more schools dealing with stereotypes and how to overcome them. The whole panoply, by the way, of détente era measures, how to reduce tensions and how provide understanding that Jeremy mentioned, that we completely ignored today at our discussion. It was an enormous gamut of practices that had been invented, tried, applied. They succeeded in tactical way. They didn't succeed in a strategic way, but that's another story. But they should be mentioned. It's all about the Arbatov school. And I think between these two opposite approaches was the mid foreign policy approach of good professionals. And sometimes we, indeed, I agree with you, Phil, we're too harsh on them, calling them Gromyko school. We sort of buy the criticism of these group of people that emanated actually from the KGB and GRU, who felt more free, more entrepreneurial, and called all those people agramychene. They were like, slightly dumbed down by Gromyko. It's not true, and I agree that was a very, very structural school that maybe didn't allow some, and that was a good reason. They didn't allow a room for heroic foreign policy of Khrushchevian style and later Gorbachev style, but they were sort of fail-proof set of rules that they followed that provided slow and gradual advance in all chosen directions. So that's why Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, when they came, they brushed them aside to a certain extent because they wanted something heroic, they wanted something quick. But those professionals predictably frowned at amateurism and warned of possible dire consequences. Well, they were crowing, of course, into the void.
Arnie and then Tim.
It's a fascinating session. I'm reminded of why I decided to call my chapter in this new book on this era for the age of Brezhnev. My students really hate that when they see it, but this session has helped confirm to me that there is a lot that is right in it. Now, on this issue of staffing and leadership, I think that's a really interesting discussion. And Soviet foreign policy during the 1970s there stand out to me very much as a game of two halves. Right? So the people do not change, certainly in terms of the staffing aspects. They are very professional, they're very good, they are capable of a lot of very good thinking. What changes is in terms of the leadership. So the leadership weakens very dramatically, and this goes back to Serhi's point as well. It has to do with aging, it has to do with health, it has to do with a lot of things that happen at the very top. And that's the period in the late 1970s when, at least I see, some very definite examples of Soviet overstretch in terms of international affairs. Angola, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, which the best staffing in the world could not have dealt with because there is a vacuum at the top. There is an inability to translate all of those abilities in diplomatic terms and intelligence terms, or for that matter in military terms, over to a strategic long-term set of action, which can only be created by good and strategic leadership.
Just a fun point of information. This is a great panel. We do have one taped summit. There's only one U.S.-Soviet summit that for which we have a recording, and that's the 1973 summit. And you both Vlad and Jeremy probably know this, but many of the others here probably don't. If you want to hear Brezhnev talking and listen to Brezhnev and Nixon talking to each other, we have that on tape. 5 years ago, the Nixon Library released it. It's very interesting, and I think it shows Brezhnev to be intellectually extraordinarily weak. And I think you'll also find that the memcons of these meetings are different from the tapes. So if you really, it's the only taped summit we have. There's no tape that we know of Vienna, and there's no tapes of Glassboro, but we do have one taped summit, and so it's worth listening to if you want to get a sense of the superpower relationship and want to assess Brezhnev. Thanks.
Other questions? Yes, Dale. Alfred Dale is right here next to Mel in second row middle.
Just a very quick question, because I largely agree with the idea that the more understanding between leaders and between bureaucracies is good for international relations. I'm a big believer in that. But there's always this tension, at least from where I come from, the study of political science and international relations, the problem of deception. And that is that you can obviously want to communicate, you can communicate with that smile and that friendship, build those personal relationships. But if the person is trying to deceive you, you have to be very wary of that. And of course, the ultimate example is when Bush, second Bush, said, I looked into Putin's soul, paraphrase, looked into Putin's soul and I liked what I saw and I understand the man. And obviously that was a pure deception. It reminds me of the Woody Allen joke that he failed first-year philosophy because he looked into the soul of the person next to him on the final exam. Well, you know, you can't do that. That's the problem of other minds in philosophy circles. You can't look into the other person and see their true intentions, and you might be deceived. So I'm wondering how you as historians would grapple with this age-old problem in my field of how do you deal with that tension between trying to understand another and also deal with the problem of deception.
This is a great question. It connects to Arne and Tim's points as well. I think that the policymakers who get their adversary and their allies, who understand the other side, they come to it through a combination of two routes, right? One is they come to it from their personal impressions, but they also come to it from having a rigorous process around them that is providing contextual knowledge and forcing them to think that through. And that's what I would call a good process, right? You don't just read, you know, the CIA psychological profile of someone and go on that. You combine that with your experience with them. So it's not just more information, it's how you're processing it. And I really do think Franklin Roosevelt is a master at this. I mean, he's spending a lot of time with Stalin and Churchill, and then he has multiple people working for him who are not working with each other, by the way, who are bringing him information, and he's actually using that information as he's planning moment to moment. The problem with Roosevelt's process is that it takes an enormous amount of energy by him, by he the president, right? And that's why he dies, one of the reasons he dies so much younger than Churchill and Stalin. By the way, Frank didn't say this, but I thought one of the most important insights in any paper for this conference was Frank Castiglio's insight that if Franklin Roosevelt lived as long as George Kennan, Franklin Roosevelt would have been alive during Able Archer in '83. That is hard to imagine, isn't it? That is really hard to imagine, in part because of the way he managed his leadership.
I don't even know. Well, you know, I do think that this is the limit of a limit. There's a limit for how much we can understand about our interlocutor, and what kicks in is our perceptions of him or her. Is he a partner? Do I need him for my policy in a certain policy framework? Or he is an adversary. So if this is Stalin of 1945, as Sergei Plokhy wrote in his book, Roosevelt needed him. He hoped to use Stalin as a post-war partner for creating a post-war order. He knows that Stalin is capable of infinite deception, but that does not matter as much as it would when you're Truman and begin to see Stalin as an adversary, and then your optic completely flips. Then deception becomes a justification for a complete mistrust. And it's really striking how, particularly in U.S. foreign policy, particularly during the Cold War, how much more tolerant are American diplomats and policymakers towards people whom they perceive to be their allies or useful son of the beach category, and then their adversaries. So a compromise stops at the door of, at the border of the Soviet Union. Understanding stops, empathy stops at the border, at the doorstep of the Kremlin, and so on and so forth. There's some remarkable exceptions, and there's one remarkable exception is Brezhnev-Nixon meeting.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's remarkable, and nobody could predict it. As Brezhnev takes him aside, basically abducts him to the horror of his, whatever. Entourage, takes him over with who was Sukhadrev translating, and all of a sudden they begin to feel like they're both intensely insecure individuals, both have enormous power, and yet they can trust each other.
Right.
And it's a miracle.
I think that I just wanted to, if I could, just want to say one more thing just to build on. I think Vlad's nailed it. I think what's so important is for a leader to develop a complex portrait of his or her interlocutors and then to educate the American public about that. And I think one of the things that makes this so difficult is our rhetoric at home has always been simplistic, but it's become even more simplistic. And I think this happened to Obama as much as it's happened to others, is you get locked in to your political rhetoric at home more so than ever before. That is one of the things that's still extraordinary to me about Ronald Reagan, that he could walk past that he could create an evil empire image, but then actually sell another image of Gorbachev. That might be more important than his strategic thinking, his ability to sell that image. We understate the importance of that when we think about policymaking, but I would include that in Philip's staffing. When you're staffing foreign policy, it's also how you're selling the foreign policy at home, right?
Well, we must draw this wonderful panel to an end. Thank you so much. Let's give a big round of applause to our panelists.